Whole song, yeah?
Just a few minutes.
Okay, yeah. So do maybe another minute and then we'll introduce you. Perfect.
To the end of time. It sustains my soul when I'm well and alive or sick in bed. The good and dead, I'll be fine. All down the line.
It's going to go live now in 10 seconds and the camera is going live now.
Welcome back, gentle listeners, for another episode of Faith and Reason. My name is Dr. Gaven Kerr, and who am I joined with today?
Hey, my name's Nathaniel. I go by Hunter Olson. I'm a student at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth.
I like the way you had to sort of, take a wee minute to remember what your name was there.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Still nervous.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Gentle listeners, that was the Hillbilly Thomists that we opened up with. Nathaniel's going to tell us in a couple of minutes his funny story about meeting the banjo player from the Hillbilly Thomists here in Maynooth. But before we do that, perhaps we should tell the gentle listeners how to get in touch with us.
Yeah.
Let's tell them.
Sounds right.
So, for anybody who would like to get in touch, we are Radio Maria Ireland. Our postal address is Radio Maria Ireland, St Anthony's Business Park, Ballymount Road, Dublin 22. That's Radio Maria Ireland, St Anthony's Business Park, Ballymount Road, Dublin 22. If you'd like to call us, the number is 014123456. That's 014123456. And if you're calling from outside of Ireland, it's plus 353 1412 3456. That's plus 353 1412 3456. For anybody who would like to text or WhatsApp, and please do text and WhatsApp, send in your most difficult questions for Hunter. Hunter is a student of philosophy. We want to put him on his toes. We want to keep him going. If you want to text or WhatsApp, it's 089 467 2000. That's 089 467 2000. And from outside of Ireland, that's plus 353 89 467 2000. That's plus 353 89 467 2000. Finally, for those who would like to email, it's info@radiomaria.ie. That's info@radiomaria.ie. And we do like to get some mail, we do like to get some feedback, and we were just saying, Nathaniel, weren't we, that once we get some hate mail, we know that we've made it.
Right, that's
Okay.
right.
Hate
mail and death threats.
Yeah, that's what we're after. So, I guess we should tell the gentle listeners why you're here and why the indefatigable Niamh Palmer isn't here.
Right. So as I understand it, Niamh Palmer, she's right now, she's in transit. She's coming back from Rome from, I think it's a retreat that she went to. Was it a retreat or?
I'm not sure. I just know she was in Rome.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I'm here. Gavin graciously invited me here, and glad to be here. So right now I'm a student at St. Patrick's College. I'm going for my master's in philosophy. And I've been here for almost a week now. I've just been settling into my accommodations, been getting the orientation and sort of just exploring, the town of Maynooth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're very welcome to be here. We do miss Niamh, but she is travelling at the minute. She had a delayed flight. She's been messaging me, saying, trying to get here, but hopefully we'll get her here in the future.
Yeah, maybe she'll send a couple questions over.
Yeah. Oh, we've asked her to send into the WhatsApp, so we hope she's watching. So, Nathaniel, you've told us a little bit about yourself there already. Before we get into anything too deep or too heavy, which we've been known to do on Faith and Reason, why don't you tell us your Thomas Joseph White story, meeting Thomas Joseph White?
Yeah, so what happened was I had met Thomas Joseph White. I was here for a conference back in April that St. Patrick's College was promoting, and I was very, very excited, but also very nervous to meet Father Thomas Joseph White because I think, as you said, I'm a bit of a fanboy, you might say. I've read a lot of his works on Thomism, Christology, and he's recently published a book on the Trinity, which I need to get to. It's a nice, sizable, thick book, but. Yeah, and I met him in person. I did not look at all impressive looking. He was there, full on his Dominican habit, and I think I was there in athletic shorts and a t-shirt. It was really bad. I was like, okay, I look like a complete plebeian, but you know what? it's all good.
Mm. And so Thomas Joseph White, as Nathaniel says, he's published an awful lot on Thomism, Christology, Trinity and stuff, but he is the banjo player for the Hillbilly Thomists, the band that you just heard at our intro. He plays the banjo for them.
Yeah.
And Nathaniel here brought over his copies of his T.J. White books.
Yes.
And the new Hillbilly Thomist CD.
Yes.
And Nathaniel came up to me and he says, Gavin, should I ask Thomas Joseph White for an autograph? And I said, sure, go on.
Yeah, it was the most terrifying thing. I think in the at least what I've experienced in Europe, the academic sort of atmosphere is much less formal. It's much more approachable. Whereas in the States, the undergrads are the undergrads, and the postgrads are the postgrads, and the teachers are the teachers, and never the twain will meet.
Yeah. So you were able to approach.
Yes,
Thomas
I
Joseph.
was. Yeah, and he was very nice. Yeah.
You got all your autographs?
I did. Yeah.
So Nathaniel, you're here. You're doing a philosophy degree.
Yes.
And the gentle listeners at Faith and Reason know that we like our philosophy here. We like our theology as well. Tell me a little bit about what interests you in philosophy and about your own sort of faith background and its relationship to philosophy.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So, as you said, I'm an aspiring philosopher, particularly interested in Thomism. I'm a Thomist, but I'm also a medievalist, and medieval history is sort of actually what got me interested in St. Thomas and Thomism originally. I'm very interested in studying the medieval period and sort of the culture and the lifestyle, the warfare, and all those things of the medieval period. But I think what's interesting for me, what's most interesting about the medieval period is there was such a vibrant and well-developed philosophy that sort of grew out of these earlier works, these earlier Greek works of Plato and Neoplatonism. And yeah, that's how I eventually came to appreciate St. Thomas. And of course, I myself am Roman Catholic, so that I think that also pointed me into the direction of St. Thomas.
And I like the way you get excited and animated about that story. Every time your hand hits the table, there's a thump.
Yeah. need to be careful. The microphones are sensitive.
Oh yeah, you're just thumping as you go. This is my story. This is what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a similar story whenever I got interested in philosophy. So I mean, I'm Catholic as well. Always wanted, to always aspired to be a saint from the earliest age. Always thought, just like C.S. Lewis said, this has to be, the most important thing in the world, or it's just all crazy stuff. And I always thought when I was young, well, if I'm going to believe in God and have a relationship with God, this has to be the most important relationship I engage in. And being sort of just an intellectual sort of person anyway, I found in the likes of Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, friends, companions of people who wanted to take that relationship with God to the next level, who wanted to really give everything in their intellectual lives over to God to draw close to Him. Did you have a similar experience?
Oh, I think very much so. And it's very interesting because the intellectual life and the intellectual pursuit, it has its own sort of prayerful dimension to it. I remember there was a work by, I think it was a 19th, 20th century philosopher, Sertalange.
Yep.
Yeah, about how when you cultivate an academic interest in philosophy and metaphysics, sure, it gives you a sort of natural sense of wonder and excitement, but it also can be effective. It can sort of grow in your holiness and longing for God.
Yeah. I mean, when you cultivate that intellectual life, it's almost like a conduit for God. God is able to work in you in that sort of way. It's kind of like when people cultivate a life of charity, say through the Legion of Mary, through helping homeless people. God is able to work, graces in that sort of way, by doing all these wonderful charitable works.
Right.
I mean, which are very visible, in the church. But it's the same for the intellectual life, which maybe we might have lost a little bit of sight of, that God works through the intellect. And,
right.
For people like us, and, not to compare ourselves to Aquinas, but in that sort of same sort of way of life, God works His grace within us and brings us towards Him through that intellectual life.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And there was an interesting debate in the medieval period whether or not philosophy, or speculative philosophy at the very least, was it was purely speculative, that the only purpose it served was to sort of illuminate and perfect your intellect. You get sort of wisdom, wisdom being sort of the highest activity of the human person. And that's what, at the end of the day, that's why you undertook metaphysics, for instance. But I think that there's a very... there was a more marginal strand, I think Bonaventure sort of latches onto this, that suggested that philosophy is supposed to bring you closer to God and supposed to increase your capacity to love God if you're doing philosophy right. If you do it wrong, then it could lead you into not so great circumstances. But yeah.
And that's that ties back into the philosopher Plato that our gentle listeners have been told all about in nearly every episode, and especially Plato's Cave. The idea that when you do philosophy correctly, it's an arduous journey out of the darkness of the cave into the light, and the light is dazzling. But like moths to the flame, we're constantly attracted to that light. And as Niamh has made the point on a number of previous episodes, that when you see the light, you may want to turn and go back into the cave, but having seen the light, you're changed forever.
Right.
When you've seen the light outside the cave, you're changed forever. And in the intellectual life, in the Christian intellectual life, when God has touched your intellect through grace, that's you changed forever. You may go off the rails a wee bit, but you're never going to forget that connection that you've made with God in the intellectual life. And isn't that what the great sort of theologians and thinkers of the Christian tradition sort of bring to bear? When we read them, we're affected in a certain way. They in effect become transparent sort of ways in which we can draw close to God. Absolutely, yes, yeah. And I think even in the mystical tradition, you can make the case that the intellect and it's sort of the gateway to expanding your love and expanding charity. I think Catherine of Siena in her dialogue, she sort of makes this point very, very clearly. That the intellect is sort of the window of the soul. Yeah. You're absolutely right. A lot of people, they sometimes separate the mind and the heart. They really do, and they ask it, and you'll hear it said an awful lot, I'm more about the heart because God is about the heart, because that's where you love, and so it's less about the intellect and more about the heart. And there could be nothing further from Catholicism and Catholic theology. There is no separation of mind and heart in the Catholic tradition. When you expand your intellect, you expand your heart, because what is your heart other than the desire for the good? Right. That's what it's, our desire for the good. And that's where our love comes from, that desire for the good. But in order to desire the good, you need to know it first. You need to understand it and embrace it. Unless something is presented to you as good, how can you even know that it is good in order to love it? Right. So the only way that you can love more and more is to know more and more. All expansion of love comes with an expansion of the intellect. Wouldn't you agree? Yes, absolutely. And I think there's also a beautiful aspect of Catholic theology, but maybe metaphysics more broadly, that there's a certain dimension to understanding God, and that the whole point of it is that you don't understand God, that you sort of negate all these imperfections or what you're sort of putting on or predicating of God that don't do God justice, and part of the soul's sort of journey to God is sort of to negate all these imperfections until you realize that whatever God is pure goodness, God is pure love, God is pure being. But what that is in itself, it's supremely intelligible in itself, but it's not intelligible to us, at least this side of the grave. The mystical tradition is very big on that. You can think of the cloud of unknowing. You think of Teresa of Avila. You think of St. John of the Cross, the dark night. Oh yeah. The dark night is not a night of despair. It's not a night of worry or concern. The darkness that is felt when one is embracing God is actually a superabundance of luminosity. Right. God is so light, luminous to us, that it's experienced as a darkness. It's so dazzling. When we undertake that journey, what Teresa of Avila would call that inner journey up the citadel of perfection, we need to purge ourselves of everything, and that feels like a darkness. And what you describe in a theological reflection, that our conception of God is what's called a negative conception. God is not composite. God is not bodily. God is not material. God is not this, that, and the other. So God is this sort of otherness beyond all these, negations. Right. is exactly what that mystical tradition is getting at. And I've always found it fascinating that it was the Middle Ages that gave us that mystical tradition of, you know, the purging of the senses and the soul,
Right.
but also gave us that negative theology
Yes,
as well.
definitely. Yeah, no, I think that's another interesting thing about the medieval era is that they ask questions in a certain way that are sort of unprecedented for other periods of time for philosophy. That doesn't mean that you have to sort of just have to be a Christian or have to be, you know, a Jewish in order to ask them, but sort of. I think that was a point that you made at the conference about whether there's such a thing as a Christian philosophy, and in a sense, your faith can sort of pave the way for asking certain questions, but it doesn't determine them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So your faith predisposes you to ask these deep and probing questions
Right.
about creation, about the nature of substances, if
Yes.
you believe in the Eucharist,
Yes.
about what a person is, given the Trinity.
Or
But-
angels.
Yeah. But it doesn't answer them.
Right.
In a philosophical way. It certainly gives you revealed answers, but the philosophy has to come in there and really regiment things and put it forth. And
No, absolutely, and it's always the case that in a good theology is always going to be dependent upon a good philosophy. Because if you ask questions about, you know, Christ emptying himself, taking on the form of humanity, what does it mean to take on a human nature? What is a human nature? What is personhood? These are sort of questions that a theology doesn't answer because it's not really part of its subject matter for the science, but the philosophy does ask these questions.
yeah, and that approach to philosophy and theology, it's very distinctive in the Catholic tradition that, you know, we never just read scripture and think, oh, that's interesting, that's nice. Let's just deal with the narrative that's there and move on.
Right.
It's no, we squeeze scripture like a sponge and we get everything out of scripture we can. So when Christ talks about his body being real food, we're like, well, that's not just an interesting story. Let's dig into that.
Right, exactly.
And see what he means about that. And that's a distinctively Catholic way of reading scripture, isn't it?
Right, definitely. And I think a good philosophy could also safeguard you from reading scripture in sort of a juvenile or an interesting fashion, because if you read the Old Testament, there's plenty of metaphor that's obviously being used about God becoming angry or God becoming drunk or things that are walking in gardens. And if you have a proper understanding of God, you'll know that, okay, these are obviously metaphor, whereas other predications or what the medievals would call divine names, they properly apply to God.
Yeah, yeah. So if you've got a good philosophy behind you, you know whenever you're reading that God walked in the garden, that he, you know, it's just silly to ask, was he wearing sandals?
Right.
Was he barefoot? It's
Right.
like, well, no. You know, he's not walking, he is present with them. That's the idea.
Right. When he was drunk, was he drinking Bushmills or Jack Daniels? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's that overjoyedness, you know,
Right.
that comes from that. Yeah. Well, that was an intense first, you know.
Okay,
18
yeah.
minutes.
Hopefully we were able to keep the conversation going, because we went to a lot of topics very quickly.
Oh, there's plenty to dig into, But what we'll do is we'll give the gentle listeners a wee time for a coffee, you know, a biscuit, a cup of tea, or whatever.
Sounds good.
What we'll do when we come back is I want to hear more about your story, Nathaniel. I want to hear about, you know, kind of your education and what brought you to philosophy and what brought you to St. Patrick's.
Sure.
And we'll chat a wee bit about that. But we'll let the gentle listeners go and wind the brains down a wee bit, have a tea, coffee, and we'll come back after this musical interlude.
Sounds good.
Love is patient, love is kind. It does not boast, it does not rely upon itself. Make me patient, make me kind. Take my love, may it not run dry. Well, I spend my days like I'm running out of time. Even for the gospel cause, it's as if I fell behind. Though the world keeps turning the same rate since the start, I keep running mad and wild as if Jesus had no part.
patient, love is kind. It does not boast, it does not rely upon itself. Make me patient, make me kind. Take my love, may it not run dry. Where we all would wish to slow this train on down, but the other half of my restless heart still carries me round town. If the Lord is in each moment passing by, draw me to your open arms, look my neighbor in the eye. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not boast, it does not rely upon itself. Make me patient, make me kind. Take my love.
Just 30 seconds there now. Perfect. Thanks, Will.
Love is patient, love is kind. It does not boast, it does not rely upon itself. Make me
10 seconds.
patient, make me kind. Take my love, may it not run dry.
Welcome back, gentle listeners. Welcome back. Welcome back, Nathaniel. How was
Hello.
that for you?
It was great. Nice to listen to the Hillbilly Thomists as always.
The
It's a
Hillbilly
cool
Thomas.
name too. Very, very distinctive.
Do you know where that name, the Hillbilly Thomas, comes from?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
It comes from one of my favorite writers. It's just Southern Gothic writer, and I think the 50s. Her name was Flannery O'Connor, and she was writing her first novel or first short story. I think it was Wise Blood, and it was a very. If anyone's ever read Flannery O'Connor, you know that she's very dark, very gritty. You can kind of get depressing, but there are times where you almost have to laugh because it's just the amount of depressingness is just ridiculous. But one newspaper article published saying that she, the tone of her works is just hillbilly nihilism, and she corrected it saying, I'm not a hillbilly nihilist, I am a hillbilly Thomist, because in Flannery O'Connor there's a very constant theme of grace redeeming fallen or human nature that's compromised, and that's a theme that is constant in her works.
Absolutely. Well, we've heard a wee bit about, the life of faith and reason, and, we went off the deep end there into the medievals, which is fine, which is good, I hope the gentle listeners are getting a real feel that there's such a richness to the Catholic philosophical and theological tradition that I know whenever I came to philosophy, I was just never exposed to. And I was always Catholic, but I just know that there was this tradition that I had to go and really dig deep and find out for myself, and just never had the exposure to it. What about your own story?
Yeah, so for me, I think around high school, I very much wanted to find not so much a philosophy for my faith, but a philosophy, because I think there were a lot of questions that I was asking, and my life wasn't really where I wanted it to be. And so I started to do investigating, and the theists that I had heard of, or the philosophy of religion types, they never felt very compelling from what I listened to. And a big problem, especially for me, was the question of why there has to be one God. Why is there one God, and why can't God be a plurality, and why can't they why is he ultimate, I suppose is the best question. And I think it was reading Edward Fazer's work, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, that was an introduction to St. Thomas. And with St. Thomas, he's very good at showing you why God as we said a little bit before, he's radically other, but he's also supremely one. He's not something that can be multiplied even in principle.
That book, Feezer's book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, it's a great book.
Oh yeah, very accessible. Yeah.
I read it in 2017, and I was reading the Thomistic proof in it, and I was just going through it, and then all of a sudden, Feezer mentions me in it.
Oh, fine.
There's a footnote, and I'm like, oh goodness.
Yeah.
I couldn't, because my book had just come out maybe 2 years before, and I didn't think,
anyone. Well.
And then all of a sudden, Feezer just, directed, and I'm like, oh dear me.
Yeah. Will you say good things?
Yeah. He really recommended it. What I loved about that Feezer book is it's 5 proofs for the existence of God. It's not 5 ways to God the way Thomas does, but it's 5 proofs, and he does a proof from Neoplatonism.
Yes.
A proof from Aristotle.
Yeah.
A proof from St. Thomas.
Yeah.
A proof, isn't it, from Leibniz?
Yes, and one from Augustine.
Yeah. So all these very different thinkers, really different from each other. Not all of them Catholic. So the Neoplatonists, they're pagans.
Yeah.
Leibniz, I think, was European
Protestant. Yeah.
But all these proofs for God, which just slot right in there with the Catholic philosophical and theological tradition, and bring us to what's known as classical theism. That there's one God, ultimate, all things depend on him, eternal, immutable.
Right.
So you came across that at a point in your life, and that really turned the corner then?
Yeah, I think that's when I started investigating St. Thomas in particular, but then I was sort of drawn into sort of understanding sort of medieval philosophy in general, because Aquinas doesn't come in a vacuum. I mean, there's a great tradition of philosophical literature that precedes him that he's relying on, that he utilizes, and sometimes critiques.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you got drawn into that tradition, and you got to see that tradition?
Yeah, very much so.
And so when that happened, did that have an impact on your life of faith and your maturity? You're maturing in this spiritual life?
Yeah, I think so. I think it very much helped me to just dispense of the idea that of an anthropomorphized understanding of God, because that was never really clear to me growing up, because on one hand we'd hold that God is, he's, I think what when Catechism says the supreme being is the word that was used, or he's all good, he's all powerful, all these things, but that was never separated necessarily from the metaphors that you find in Scripture. And I think that turn in philosophy, it very much helped me out. And interestingly enough, I'm not the. It wasn't. That's not just me that sort of had that discovery. If you read Augustine's Confessions, one of the biggest hang-ups he has is understanding God as immaterial instead of this really large substance that's airy and
I think you're absolutely right, because necessarily when young people are brought into the faith and catechized, I mean, what adult could understand, God is one, simple, eternal, as let alone, a small child. So the way we, bring people into the faith and catechize them is necessarily, God is Father, He's Abba. We can have this parental relationship with God, and that obviously that's what Christ revealed.
Yeah.
But Christ also revealed, God as this the eternal source of all things, loving source of all things, which has a very rich philosophical background to it, and Christ brings that revelation with him as well. So you get that warm, loving, parental sort of figure of God, the Good Shepherd, but you also get the principle through whom all things are made, and all of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes that second bit, the more philosophical bit, can be overlooked. In which case it's like two lungs or two wings. If one of them is not strong enough, the other one does all the heavy lifting.
Right.
The entire substance as a whole, finds it difficult to breathe or fly.
Right. Right. And I think one of the another aspect of St. Thomas's philosophy that very much helped me is understanding divine providence, of how God really does look after every aspect of existence. Yeah. Because when you read that in the Bible, I mean, you can come away from it that the idea that God, he might just, it's not altogether clear how he's caring for everything, or how everything, is within his power.
Yeah, absolutely. You read in the Psalms, just about how, everything kind of, is of interest to God, but then you read in, other places, how God is simply concerned with Israel, simply concerned, with the patriarchs of Israel, simply concerned with this or that. And so it's about balancing that vision of God being, concerned for you and your salvation, but also being concerned about the rotation of the earth around the sun and
exactly.
whatever's happening in some galaxy far, far away. That God is, concerned about you more because, you're in His image and likeness, but also, concerned about these because He's holding it all in creation. And when you focus on that, just that one side of that sort of personal relationship to God as Father, you lose that sort of cosmic image, that sort of awesome cosmic image of God holding all of creation in existence.
Right.
And that, I think, just makes that personal relationship more profound, because the God that created everything and holds everything in existence out of nothing, He didn't need to use any resources other than His own to do that.
Right.
Has a personal interest in your salvation.
Right.
So, whenever you can pray to God and enter into a relationship with Him through prayer, that is the one that's holding literally everything in existence.
Right.
Yeah. So, rather, as we were saying earlier, some people, divide the head and the heart. I mean, I think if we think about our faith in that way, the head will only go to allow the heart to grow more and fall more and more in love with God.
Precisely, yeah. And I think another, not to go off on a tangent, but I think another thing that the sort of Catholic philosophical tradition helped me with is trying to understand not just the problem of evil, but what even is evil. Yeah. And I think you've talked with Neve on the show a bit before about evil, but I think growing up, I kind of had an almost Manichaean, almost like Gnostic idea of what evil is. I saw the material world as evil because the material world is, well, it's where we get all, whatever desires that. Yeah, I think that's the reason.
The bad stuff happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that after reading the Confessions, because that was where I actually first discovered this insight that evil is not at all understood as a thing. It's not a substance. It's not a created thing. It's a lack or a privation is a better word.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And for the gentle listeners, just what Nathaniel is referring to here is that, it's a Gnostic belief, very, very early. Gnostics, I think, were contemporaneous with some of the evangelists, but definitely a very, very early view. And then it led into Manichaeism, which St. Augustine was part of. And these sorts of groups, they felt that all of reality is composed of two mutually opposing forces, a force of good and a force of evil. And even when it came to the Manichaeans, they saw that the force of goodness was pure spirit and the force of evil was pure material, and they were at war with each other. And the Manichaeans believed that God represented in the Old Testament was the bad God, the God of matter, and God represented by the New Testament was a good God, a spiritual God. And St. Augustine believed this. And interestingly, St. Augustine wasn't converted back to the faith, by Catholic writers.
Right.
It was Ambrose of Milan, former pagan, who before he was even baptized was elected bishop of Milan. And Ambrose of Milan introduced St. Augustine to a Neoplatonic writer called Plotinus. And it was reading Plotinus that St. Augustine could see how spiritual reality is responsible for material reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that material reality, if there's anything evil to it, it's just that there's a lack of goodness. It's a lack of light.
Right.
But the evil doesn't have any reality of itself. And you know what that meant for Augustine and what it means for us? It means if evil doesn't have any reality in itself, it doesn't get the final word.
Right, exactly.
Evil doesn't win in the end. It's God, the good, that wins in the end, because God is what's ultimately real. And we're all participations in that. So anything that's evil just is a falling away from that.
And that's why you can't really have a purely evil entity or purely evil God, because that would just be a no thing. It would be nothing.
Exactly. And you mentioned that Neve and I chatted about this. Actually, one of the gentle listeners asked, what about the devil? What about Lucifer? Isn't he purely evil? And it's always a great discussion to have about the fall of the demons, because the demons are angels. They're angels. And as angels, they're good. Their natures are good. God created them and keeps them in existence. Their choices, however, they haven't made great choices.
Right, exactly.
They have made the worst sort of choices. And that's what we call evil. It's they're making those bad choices, but the things in themselves aren't evil. There can't be a source of all evil, because evil isn't a thing that has a source.
Right. I mean, they're still, at the end of the day, I mean, whatever hierarchical, angel the devil was. I mean, I think there's debate whether he's a cherubim or a seraphim, whatever. I mean, he's still that substance, just corrupted. And in Dante, I think that you get this very well, that when Dante and in his work, the Inferno, when they're going to the lowest ring of hell and they encounter Satan in a frozen lake, he's still an angel. He still has his wings, but the wings are bat wings. They're like this grotesque, monstrosity, indicating that he's still an angel, just one that's corrupted.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's always, something to get across, because I think there's a tendency today amongst a lot of contemporary Catholics, and it's not ill-natured, and it's not because they don't want to think along with the Church's theology. It's just that nobody's informed any different. There is this tendency to think that if you have God, there must be God's opposite, which is something which is pure evil, which is the Manichaean view. It's the Gnostic view. It was the Albigensian view, and St. Dominic founded an order, the Order of Preachers, to preach against this very view in France. And
I think that one of the reasons why this heresy is so problematic for the Catholic faith is that a lot of our theology is based on the material world, like God taking on, really uniting to himself our human nature, or the sacraments. I mean, a lot of it's because we're material beings.
Absolutely. God uses material things to redeem us. The sacraments makes use of material things to redeem us. It was through a material substance that we fail. Okay, so God uses material things to bring us back up again.
Right.
To show us that it's not the material things themselves which are bad, it's how our wills are directed towards them. So God uses those material things to redirect our wills, our hearts, to Him. So a theology like Manichaeism or Albigensianism, which says no, material things are purely evil, undermines the sacraments, undermines the incarnation, undermines all of it. So it is just so destructive to Catholic thinking. So gentle listeners, read your St. Augustine for that. He'll keep you right. We are at the end of another segment.
All right then.
It just flies in. Gentle listeners, go have another tea, another coffee. Have a big coffee and a big biscuit, and we'll catch you after the music.
Sounds good.
Assistance, Lord, come to my help. The waters have reached high, they're up to my neck, they're up to my neck. Our help is in the name of the Lord. Every hour, every day, our help is in the name of the Lord. Tears from looking for you. My foes compass me about. They blaze like a fire. They blaze like a fire. Our help is in the name of the Lord. Every hour, every day, our help is in the name of the Lord.
Just 30 seconds there now. Perfect.
Come to my help, Lord, come to my help. Our help is in the name of the Lord. Every hour, every day, our help is in the name of the Lord.
Just 10 seconds.
Our help is in the name of the Lord. Our help is in the name of the Lord.
Welcome back, gentle listeners. I hope you have tea, coffee, biscuits, or have had them anyway. How are you feeling, Nathaniel?
Doing great.
You're doing great. We have got a text message. It always makes me nervous. I've asked for hate mail. I have asked for hate mail. We still haven't got it.
Are you worried that like you'll ever like pull up the notifications and there'll be some hate comments or?
Oh, and then we'll dedicate it. We'll do a Fraser Crane an entire show.
Right.
We'll deconstruct these comments. And so this person said such a. Let's just look at that. Nancy Denahan has sent us a message in. Nancy says, "Good to hear you both." Thank you, Nancy. Good to hear from you. Suffering is hard, but I suppose it brings us closer to God. Nancy, you don't just suppose. You're absolutely right. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, I think that this sort of ties into a bigger philosophical discussion to be had about not so much the nature of evil, because I mean, okay, we can understand that it's a non-being, it's a privation, but this question sort of asks, okay, if God is sovereign and everything is in his control, then why does he permit evil to come about? And I think that suffering is an instance of that. It's a very real instance of something that you can experience, because you can think of evil abstractly in philosophical terms, but when you experience an evil, it hits you so much harder.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, it's all well and good saying, you've got the problem of evil. If God exists, evil doesn't. Evil does exist, therefore God doesn't exist.
Right.
How do we square that? And I mean, the general approach is, well, look, evil isn't a real thing that exists, so it doesn't compete with God.
Right.
So it doesn't, eradicate God, as it were. And okay, that's well and good. And generally, that resolves what in philosophy we call the logical problem of evil.
Right.
But then there's that more evidential problem. It's like, look, okay, right, God is all powerful. Granted, evil is not a thing that exists and isn't in competition with God. But just why? Why so much of those privations?
Right.
Why so much suffering? I'm a parent, we all know, parents and good people that wouldn't allow these kinds of suffering to occur. Why does our all good, loving God do it? And that's the real challenge, isn't it?
Right.
But what Nancy was pointing out there, and what we can get round to talking about, is something that a philosopher from St. Louis University in the States, Eleanor Stump, a point that she made, and she's working through the tradition as well, that suffering is redemptive. It's not that we have to undergo suffering to be redeemed, because you could live your whole life without suffering and still enjoy salvation and be redeemed through the sacraments. Rather, it's that when you do undergo suffering, in going through that suffering is an opportunity to draw close to God and to become friends with God.
Right.
And that is in itself its own reward, because God is the source of all goodness. So being able to go through that suffering and be with God during that suffering brings you into closer friendship with Him, with the source of all goodness. So just as you go to the dentist, you endure the bit of pain for the sake of healthy mouth, healthy teeth, no more toothache. So, and a lot of mystics will attest to this, when you go through suffering, you can be drawn closer to the Lord, and you can experience His consolation.
Right, exactly. And I think that when you look at this from the perspective of all salvation history, you can ask the question, okay, I mean, why did God allow the fall to happen? I mean, of course, God, He knows all things, He sees all things are in His control, and presumably He could have prevented Adam and Eve from falling in the garden and original sin and, etc. But He didn't, and you're asking, okay, why was that? Why did He allow these states of affairs to come about? And if I remember correctly, Eleanor Stump suggests in her book that it's ultimately because of the incarnation, that not just on a personal level with respect to suffering, but even like all of salvation history, sin is allowed to come about so that we have a Redeemer. We have the incarnation. We have Christ crucified.
Yeah. And the mystical tradition attests to this as well. Yeah.
There's a very beautiful mystic who I very much have a very strong personal devotion to. Her name is Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich, she was like a 14th, 15th, early 15th century mystic, and some would suggest theologian. She was alleged to have received a bunch of revelations from God regarding providence, the nature of evil, theodicy, etc. And she comes to the conclusion that sin and suffering is what she calls behovely. Behovely is kind of a weird word, but basically what it means is something like fitting or convenient. And you're probably thinking, okay, why is sin convenient or fitting? That doesn't make much sense. But she clarifies that it's not something that's good in of itself. It's a terrible privation, but it's fitting to allow it to come about for some other end, for some beautiful end. And I think that she suggests that it's because of the incarnation that the good Lord has seen it fit to permit sin to come about.
That's really interesting because two authors that I really enjoy, one of them, C.S. Lewis, Belfast man, another, not a Belfast man, but a friend of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien wrote this, I don't know if the readers have heard of it, a book called The Lord of the Rings.
Very obscure. We're getting quite obscure here, yeah.
And currently we have The Rings of Power on Amazon Prime at the minute, but in The Lord of the Rings, well, not the actual Lord of the Rings itself, but in that sort of universe, the Silmarillion, which was kind of a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and it sets the stage and stuff, although it was written after Lord of the Rings. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien discusses creation, and he's got a creation myth. The One, or the Iluvatar, sings creation into existence. And as the Iluvatar sings creation into existence, a disharmony occurs.
Yes.
But as a master vocalist, operatic singer, the One is able to take that disharmony and reharmonize it.
Right.
In the same way that a master musician is able to, because he is a master, to use a disharmony, a discord that you don't expect, to bring it back into harmony.
Right, right.
Any of the gentle listeners who are interested in Beethoven, notice the move in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony from the third movement, where it starts to build up, and then moves into a completely different key in the fourth movement. So in the fourth movement is the dun, dun, dun. And there's the big build up to that, and you're not expecting that at all. Beethoven is a master of doing that, taking something which seems discordant and just building it up and making it beautiful. And what you described there with Julian of Norwich, that sin and suffering are behooving, are convenient, are fitting, is kind of like that discord in the song.
Right.
That God works in that to reharmonize everything.
Right.
So that when you look at it as a whole, when you look at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony as a whole, or when you look at creation as a whole, you see, well, this is beautiful. Okay, I'm glad that's over. That suffering's over. I came out the other end, but I'm a different person, and I am now a friend of God.
Right.
After that, that's what Julian of Norwich is getting at.
Yes.
And I mentioned C.S. Lewis because for anybody who has read the Chronicles of Narnia, there's another little obscure.
Yeah.
If anybody's read the Chronicles of Narnia, I think it's in the Wizard's Nephew, or the Wizard's Apprentice.
The Magician's Nephew.
The Magician's Nephew. They see Aslan, who is God, singing everything.
Yes, exactly. And I think what's so interesting about both the creation stories of Tolkien and Lewis is they are very much drawing upon the in some sense Neoplatonic but more Christian tradition of what evil is. And there's this very interesting theme where Jadis, the White Witch, well, she's not the White Witch yet, but Jadis is really angry and really annoyed that Aslan's singing this Narnia into existence, that she takes a beam from the lamppost that she just throws it at him, and it doesn't even faze him. It's because I think what Lewis is trying to underscore is that sin is nothing, evil's nothing, and it doesn't faze God.
And what happens with that, metal bar, after it's hit Aslan, it goes into the ground, and it grows like, a street lamp, like a tree.
Yes.
Which in The Land, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Lucy finds with Mr. Tumnus.
Right.
Is that, which is so amazing that, if that's kind of like what sin is, and it's just nothing, and Aslan turns it into something life-giving, light-giving, So God's always able to reverse sin in that sort of way.
Right, exactly.
It's really fascinating, this, connection of creation with music. Because that occurs in St. Augustine as well.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's in the Platonists. And if anybody's watched The Rings of Power in the first episode, you see the elves getting to the Undying Land, and it's just song.
Yes.
And they're just drawn into this song just naturally. And we talk about, I think it's in the book of Revelation, it's the saints and the angels, they all sing Hosanna
Yes.
to the Lord. But there's something quite fascinating about music and musical harmonies, because what the Pythagoreans discovered is that musical harmonies are based on mathematical ratios. And mathematics, we can quantify created reality and interpret it using mathematics. But with music, we don't have to do the mathematics to quantify reality. We're in tune with the music. So there's something about music which directly puts the soul into connection with reality.
No, I think that's definitely true, and it's also true with a lot of theater performances. And we were just talking with some fellas earlier, and they talked about how much they love the opera. And the opera, it can captivate you, and it can sort of just lift your soul into just a higher form of joy and excitement. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to ask Nathaniel, who is your favorite philosopher?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna have to. It's not particularly original, but I'd have to say St. Thomas Aquinas would have to be a big one.
Well, that's a legitimate answer. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I'd have to say that maybe this is also cheating, but I think Julian of Norwich is also, she's not strictly speaking a philosopher, but I think that when she's going through a lot of the revelation that she receives and tries to square it with her own intuitions and Catholic belief, it's a discursive process for her. And I think that you can make a case that even she has some interesting philosophical insights on what we just discussed, the problem of evil.
Okay, tell me this. So St. Thomas is your favourite philosopher?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just a given. What is your favourite work or area of interest in Thomas? What do you think he just deals with beautifully?
Okay, yeah, I'd have to say, and it's your area of expertise. There's a very early treatise that he wrote in the beginning of his career, and it's very technical, but it's a very beautiful treatise that's drawing on so much good philosophy. It's the De Ente et Essentia. And one of the most interesting problems that Aquinas addresses is the nature of angels. It's an angelology question that prompts him to ask this question about what makes angels creatures properly. Even if God's immaterial and angels are material, what makes them different from each other? And I think that drawing on Neoplatonism, drawing on Avicenna, but making his own very beautiful original contributions, he gives just a beautiful argument for God's existence in there.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that little treatise, De Ente et Essentia, on being in essence, because, as you say, it was written at the beginning of his career. He's living in St. Jacques in Paris, where the Dominicans live.
Yeah.
And there's a number of Dominican brothers. Now, Thomas is more or less, he's writing his PhD thesis at this time. And his younger Dominican brothers come to him and say, look, we don't understand metaphysics. We don't understand philosophy. Can you help us? So he writes De Ente et Essentia.
Yes.
As a little treatise on metaphysics to help beginners, those who aren't getting it.
Right.
800 years later, we're still reading it.
We're still reading it, exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting just because I don't think anywhere, he still alludes to the insights he has in that treatise, but nowhere is he as clear, nowhere is he as direct on the discussion of angels and participation as he is in this treatise. And you have to ask yourself, okay, if that Dominican didn't ask for some help on, Metaphysics 101, would we have gotten that beautiful insight? Exactly.
And I know for me personally, that's really consumed an awful lot of my philosophical interest. And just for the gentle listeners, so as you know, what makes angels different from God, in other words, what makes them creatures like the rest of us, is that God's existence he has essentially. God has existence in virtue of what he is, so God's essence is his existence. Everything other than God, we don't have our existence essentially. Whether we're material or immaterial, we do not exist essentially. We don't exist simply in virtue of what we are. We need a distinct active existence. Did I get that right?
Yep. I mean, you are the expert here. So.
And that is a key insight of St. Thomas's. Well, fresh off of that then, who's your favourite contemporary living philosopher? Who do you like to read?
Oh, okay. So, So one of my favorite, he is a commentator. Well, okay, there's two thinkers that right now I'm reading that are just blowing me away very much. One is Jacques Maritain. He's not necessarily contemporary. He died in the 20th century, but he is very much drawing on St. Thomas, but he also draws on later thinkers that are trying to defend and expand upon Aquinas, and asks very interesting questions about the nature of signs. What's the purpose of, what do signs do? And I think there's a very beautiful chapter in one of his works, The Degrees of Knowledge, where he asks those types of questions, and it's just beautiful. But another I think contemporary that I'm very much interested in is John Whipple. In fact, you had a copy of Whipple's, I think, Metaphysical Themes just a little earlier that you had in the office, and I think with him, he's very good at giving good philosophy, but giving it in a very historically sensitive context. Because I'm a philosopher, but I'm also an aspiring medievalist, and I think that if you get the history right, if you're careful on the historical background, it very much helps you understand better the philosophy.
Yeah, and just so the gentle listeners, for their interest, Jacques Maritain is one of the figures who helped write the
Yes.
Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes.
So he was very much involved in that. And swinging it back to the start of our conversation, something nice to end the show with is that we talked about the head and the heart not being separate, and sometimes expanding the intellect, expanding the head allows the heart to become transformed. Jacques Maritain is one of those people who I think he and his wife, they just realised there was nothing to live for, and I think they were going to end it all.
Yes, a suicide pact. I believe if I got the story right, that when they were atheistic and when they were sort of involved in existentialist literature, they made a suicide pact with one another that if they didn't find the meaning of life, they'd kill themselves. And it's just really dramatic, and I don't know if they'd follow through with it, but they made that pact.
And then they read St. Thomas.
Yes, and then they read St. Thomas.
Well, we're at the end of our show.
Great.
That was great. We packed a lot in there, and it was sad not to have the indefatigable Niamh.
Yes, Niamh, yeah.
But I think if Niamh were here, this would be a 2-hour show.
Oh, sure.
Everybody, or maybe a 3-hour, we all get an hour to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
But hopefully Niamh will be back again with us. It was great to have you in here, Nathaniel. And
cheers.
We all wish you the best in your studies.
Thank you.
And we ask the gentle listeners to pray for us all, and especially all of us who are studying, and as we pray for you. And we'll be back next week for another episode.
Sounds good.
Thank you.